the second lecture on Deontological Ethics, particularly focusing upon Immanuel Kant. Let's see. Okay. From Deon meaning duty. We are supposed to act from duty, out of duty, in order to fulfill our duty. When we act in concert with duty, that's not as morally acceptable. So here he is in all of his glory. Nice picture here. Immanuel Kant never married, like so many other philosophers. When he was asked one time, he said that when he was younger and he had the inclination, he did not have the means, but now that he had the means, he no longer had the inclination. There are a few Kantian jokes that I've heard, but none of them are really, they're kind of misogynist, really. One of which he said is that it's clear that women will not be present at the end of the world. Because one of the things that happens, in the course of Revelations is a great silence falls upon the earth. Yeah. Okay. But nevertheless, he has some really interesting ideas. We just don't have to date him or anything. He wants us to focus very much on the goodwill. It's as being the only thing of intrinsic worth, acting from goodwill. And this is the first of the three major works on ethics. Moral knowledge is a question that we would get into more with regard to a little bit more formal class in ethics. There is a kind of stance called cognitivism and non-cognitivism, whether or not you believe that a moral statement can be proven to be either true or false. Is it the kind of thing that can be discussed as though it has a truth value to it, or is it something else? I think last recording I rambled at you a little bit about whether or not, emotivism and some other ideas where, moral knowledge is not necessarily true or false, but it's an expression of someone's own personal opinion and feeling. That's not what Kant is up to. Okay. Happiness in Kant. As far as Kant is concerned, we do not deserve happiness if we are not motivated by a goodwill. Let's see. Kant is actually very focused on freedom of a sort. Here we are. This is the quote I wanted for happiness in Kant. The sight of a being who is not graced by any touch of a pure and good will, but who yet enjoys an uninterrupted prosperity, can never delight a rational and impartial spectator. So, it's interesting. He's kind of like talking about someone else's reputation, our opinion of people who have good fortune that we don't think they deserve. But that what makes someone deserving of that is to have the goodwill, the intent to do good. Basically, the point is that, Kant does not believe our end all and be all, our ultimate goal is happiness per se. And not even happiness as eudaimonia, which is, happiness is flourishing. But just plain old happiness in any sort is not what we're about. So, Immanuel Kant believed that our ultimate goal, or his ultimate goal, was to help people to be free, to truly be free, to think for themselves, to be able to decide for themselves what is and is not moral, without having to, just simply follow the commands of someone who is, your boss, or your pastor, your religious authority and so forth, but that we should be able to discern for ourselves what it is that we ought to do. And he gives us this really nifty little sort of thought problem to be able to try and discern whether or not something is morally valuable in his sense. The first thing, so what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate moral statements, statements about morality. Those are called maxims. Okay. A maxim, I think, whenever you're contemplating doing something and you want to evaluate it as in a, using Kant's categorical imperative, you would just simply insert the words I ought or I ought not in front of that thing that you're contemplating doing. So that's what a maxim is. It's a statement about whatever action it is that we're evaluating. He believes that it also ought to be said in the form of an imperative, a statement which commands someone to perform or refrain from performing some action. So this is how we ought write our moral rules, in the form of an imperative. Right. Oh, yes. And they have to be universalizable. This is probably the only place you will ever see the word universalizable, but there it is. Utilitarianism and Kant's deontological theory, they are both kind of essentially selfless in their very nature, that you cannot consider yourself as being more important or more interesting than anyone else in your moral evaluation. That was one of the things that happens in utilitarianism, is when you evaluate what is the best thing for me to do, you have to do that thing which brings about the most happiness for the most people. And your happiness doesn't count any more than anyone else's. And you may have to sacrifice your happiness if more people can be pleased. I think there was an example given on the crash course, philosophy crash course, where you say, it's your birthday, where do you want to go out for dinner? And you choose this restaurant that, you wouldn't have chosen if you'd been perfectly free, right? Like go out for Ethiopian or something. But because it's your family and you know that they would not enjoy that, you choose something else that you think everyone can enjoy. Dim sum or something. Which is scarcely suffering, but there it is. So you kind of compromise in order to, bring about greater happiness. And I think that's a common way of reasoning as well. So our moral statements need to be applicable to everyone. No one person is to be held as being more valuable than anyone else, and that very much includes yourself. So we're going to try and formulate the actions and things that we are considering into the form of a universal maxim, an imperative maxim. And then we're going to evaluate whether or not everybody can follow that rule all at the same time. Let me go on with that. Okay. So to determine whether or not our categorical imperative is the right thing or the wrong thing to do, we are going to use our reasoning to decide whether or not it is an action that literally can be performed by everyone or ought be not performed by everyone. And if it results in a state of affairs that in some cases is going to actually undermine people's ability to carry on, then it's something we ought not do. Okay. So first we're going to look at a hypothetical imperative. Kant gives us two different kinds of imperatives. First is the hypothetical, which is an imperative that commands us to perform or not perform some action if we want to achieve a specific goal or satisfy some specific desire. These types of imperatives are generally expressed as if you want X, then you should do Y. So the hypothetical imperative is what you reason for when you're trying to achieve some given purpose. And that's okay, right? You have to figure out, to get better grades, I ought to study, I think it's the example that they give in the philosophy crash course. In my case, I said, if you're going to go into the courtroom, you have to put down the monkey. And if you want to stay clean, don't open that refrigerator. I believe that is it's an intended reference to Douglas Adams' Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. There was a terrible refrigerator in there. Maybe if you've had roommates, you've had that experience where you open the fridge and you're immediately sorry and close it again. There's those things there in the back, the science projects that time has remembered all too well. So the hypothetical imperative is the kind of reasoning that we use to try and achieve some goal, going through our daily lives. Okay. However, moral statements need to be categorical imperatives. There is no goal here that we're trying to achieve, unless the goal is to do the right thing. It's just something we need to do. We ought to be kind. It's not that we ought to be kind so that we can borrow money from more people, or we ought to be kind so we can have more friends, or we ought to be kind so that we can have more dates or whatever. We just ought to be kind to other people, regardless of anything that can be given, back to us or what have you. We simply ought to be kind. Okay, so the hypothetical imperative is tied to a particular goal. The categorical imperative means, sort of unconditionally across the entire category of actions that apply in this particular circumstance. An imperative that, the categorical imperative is an imperative that unconditionally commands us to perform or not perform some action, regardless of whether we desire to perform the action or not. It has no relation to any goal. You should do Y. Note, there is no X there. For example, you don't hang your keys from the rings of grenade pins. That sounds like a very bad way to find out that they're actually still alive. Don't kill innocents. That doesn't really need any further qualification, so it's unconditional. Okay. This is actually a really stupid cartoon, and I've been trying to find a replacement for it, but I thought we ought to have some kind of break in here. Maybe I'll hunt something down. Okay, so before we launch into the categorical imperative proper. So Kant he doesn't give us a list of things that he wants us to do or wants us not to do. He doesn't say that we need to, be fair, and he kind of takes it as obvious that we ought to be, but he gives us a way to test everything that is what we ought to do. And really, this whole work is about what would an appropriate moral statement look like, and what kind of qualities does it have to have, and what does it fulfill? A grounding for a metaphysics for morals, right? So we're sort of unpinning, well, not so much the metaphysics here, but that's what we're working up to. Okay. So the categorical imperative. There are multiple formulations in Kant's work of the categorical imperative, and they are regarded as being equivalent in his mind, of pretty much being a restatement of the same idea. You can decide for yourself whether or not that's successful. But we're going to start and pretty much work from the first formulation. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will, in this case, will is a verb, that it should become a universal law. So we ought only do those things whereby we can, at the same time, wish that everybody else can do the same thing, that this becomes a universal law that applies equally to everyone. This is universalizable. Okay, when we go through an example, I think this might be a little bit more clear. When doing this particular unit, of course, there's a lot of examples that I want you to help me work through. But that doesn't really quite work out here. Okay, the second formulation, and this is called the humanitarian principle, is act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So what he's saying here is that we need to treat everyone, including ourselves. We need to keep in mind what our goals are and what other people's goals are, and we need to interact appropriately with people such that we do not disrespect their ability to achieve their goals. That we see them as whole persons that have their own motivations and ideas and so forth. And we don't just use them as a means of obtaining our ends or our goals. So when I buy something at a cash register, I am not necessarily thinking about the person's the person behind the counter is effectively a means to an end for me. I'm not really considering oh gosh, this is a bad example. Anyway, well, this is kind of a counterexample, but I am treating them in a sense as a means to an end. I'm, paying them for my apple. I'm not really considering, their own deeper motivations, to become a great artist or anything. But usually, given the context and the circumstance, I can assume that, as the person who's behind the counter and the cashier, that their interests are served by me paying for my item and, being, given my item and so forth. Whether they're employed there, whether they own the shop, whatever. Given the context that tells me it's consistent with their ends. So this differs drastically from the utilitarian idea, where you can treat people as a means to an end. You can decide that, you know, the way that we treat people um, can lead to greater happiness. We can sacrifice some rights or ideals as long as the goals are good enough. You remember back to one of the problems with utilitarianism is you can have a situation where what we say is the ends can justify the means, no matter how horrific the means are, if the ends are good enough. And an example of that is dropping the atomic bomb, at the end of World War II in Japan, where we were using the civilians and the civilian cities of Japan as a means to an end of trying to demoralize the Japanese people and Japanese authorities to the point that they would surrender. So we didn't have to engage in a ground war. So, all those people that died, they were simply being used as a means to an end. I do not believe a Kantian would ever drop the atomic bomb. Okay. There is a third formulation, though it's really the first two that I think are the most interesting for our interests. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. So we ought to think of ourselves as like, one person congresses, right? One person legislatures, full legislating bodies. And that when we form a moral rule, it's being done with an eye to applying it to everyone. It's also interesting. One of the things that comes out here as well is that Kant talks about the duty that we have not just to others, but also we do have a duty to ourselves. I did say, it is kind of selfless in a way, but you do have certain moral obligations to yourself, to, in Kant's mind, to try and you need to take care of your body. You need to not treat your body just as a means to an end, just to get high or something. You need to take care of it. You have an obligation to try and develop your own talents, for instance, because you make a better contribution to society, and just overall, that's what you're supposed to do. Okay, so hopefully this is where this is gonna start to make sense. Okay. And this is part of Kant's idea that, again, he wants us to see ourselves as all as independent and equivalent agents, that we are capable of deciding for ourselves what the right thing is to do, sort of a government of one. Yep, sorry, I'm keeping the notes up so I can see them. So, let's make a categorical imperative. So we're going to formulate our imperative in the form of a maxim. I think the example I give here at the bottom would be thou shalt do X or not do X. That's the form of the maxim. So let's see. One reasonable example is to say that I ought to steal stuff whenever I feel like it. So, somebody has a really nice apple, and I want the apple, so I should just go ahead and steal it. That's what I'm thinking about. Okay. So I ought to steal apples or anything else whenever I want to, as long as I can get away with it. Well, now we universalize it. And instead of saying, I ought to steal things whenever I want to, now we say, everyone ought to steal things when they want to and can get away with it. You can throw that in there if you wish. And then we have to think about kind of what happens. And if the categorical imperative fails, what we're going to find is that it is ultimately inconsistent with itself, that literally it is not possible for us to will that everyone at the same time do the same thing that we do. It's not a law that everyone can follow at the same time. And sometimes the result will be consistent, will not be illogical, or come to undermine the actual principle or practice that we're investigating. It will itself, but we get to consider whether or not the state of affairs that comes about is acceptable to rational beings. So, I ought to steal stuff when I feel like it. Everyone ought to steal stuff when they feel like it. So, if everybody steals things, if I steal this person's pen and they take that person's book, and this person takes their chair, that person takes a laptop, and that one takes just one mitten away from them, we have this ongoing almost exchange of goods, really, right? And if we all kind of continue to sort of take things as we need them from one another, then our very idea of ownership and property ownership particularly may change. We may regard some of these things as being just something we all share, right? Trying to think of an example. Well, we share toilet paper in public bathrooms, and we share soap and water, things like this. And we don't resent anybody else's ability to be able to use the same thing. That's just not how it's done. So I think it is possible to say that there are some things that we freely exchange and are not terribly concerned about ownership with it. But if everybody stole from somebody something that they really liked and thought of it as being their own property, it potentially undermines the very idea of property itself. And if nobody has independent property from one another, then taking something from somebody else is no longer theft. Now you're just taking something from someone else, the same way you would take a turn at the water fountain, perhaps. So it results, this particular categorical imperative the idea that everyone ought to steal whenever they feel like it, ultimately becomes inconsistent because it brings about sort of a contradictory state of affairs that undermines the very principles, right, the very practices of ownership and so forth that make the act itself even possible. Um, so that is that example. Um, Another example is has to do with lying. And Immanuel Kant really believed that we ought never, ever, 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 ever tell a lie. And when we look at some of the issues having to do with the categorical imperative, you'll see how really serious he is about that particular stipulation. Um, so, let's see. I usually give you an example of my next door neighbor comes out of her house at the same time I do, and she says, "Oh, Amy, what do you think of my hat?" And I look at her hat, and I think about, a flock of seagulls attacking, French fries on her head. Not so much a hat as, some sort of horrendous incident that's been captured in diorama form. Um, but I like my neighbor, and I don't want to hurt her feelings. So I say, "Wow, that's a beautiful hat. I'm really impressed." Um, so I lie to my neighbor. Should I lie to my neighbor to save her feelings? At least in my mind. If I lie to save my neighbor's feelings, everyone ought to be able to lie when they can save somebody else's feelings. What happens if we all lie when we want to save somebody else's feelings? It ultimately undermines the truth, right? It undermines our ability to recognize how it is other people's opinions as being, relevant. Um, I think we already do this to some extent. That there are some kinds of things that we do lie about to protect other people's feelings, and anybody who's remotely sensible knows that, right? Um, I, uh, especially if you're married, you'll know this part. So I put on a particular dress that I think is really fantastic, and I come out and I pirouette and show it off, and I say, "Well, what do you think of my dress?" And my partner can say, "That's a gorgeous dress." "Oh my God, I thought you'd had some sort of horrible accident. And that was, bits of flesh hanging off of you. Um, or, are you going to wear that? That sort of thing. The correct answer is, that looks just fine, dear. Thank you. Um, Not necessarily. So when I ask that question, I recognize that the person that I'm asking, who is my partner, has kind of a stake, as it were, in pleasing me and maintaining our relationship, and is very unlikely to say something that might discomfort me, even if it's true. That I'm really expecting too much When I ask somebody, what do you think of my dress? That is, my friend and so on and so forth. They have a specific desire not to harm my feelings in such a way that it endangers our relationship. So there is that idea. And to an extent, I think we don't believe each other when it comes to certain kinds of things. I serve dinner to my family. I say, what did you think of this? And they all say, yum, even though some of them are like, eh. They're going to be, kind to me, and I should expect them to be kind to me and tell me what it is that they think I want to hear. I'm trying to think. There's a specific example having to do with when it is in fact consistent, but it creates a state of affairs that is not acceptable to rational beings. I'll come back to that if I can think of it. Sorry. Okay. This is the fourth version, the fourth formulation of the categorical imperative. It's called the natural law formulation. And again, this sort of starts getting us into understanding, hopefully, what Kant is really all about. Act as if the maxim of your action, the statement of what it is you're trying to do, were to become, by your will, in this case the noun, a universal law of nature. And specifically, thinking about laws of nature as being, different from laws of humans, the universal law, of nature, they are independent of one another. They do not conflict with one another, right? And they consistently apply everywhere all of the time. He's thinking about Newtonian mechanics kind of visions of the universe.